The sound of my phone vibrating against the kitchen counter made my heart race. Another bill reminder. Another notice I couldn't afford to ignore. I let out a slow breath, staring at the empty coffee cup in my hands. I needed a job, any job, before things got worse. For weeks, I had applied everywhere. Offices, diners, retail stores, places that didn't require a fancy degree or years of experience. Nothing worked out. Every rejection email felt like a door slamming in my face. Then, one evening, a job listing caught my eye: church secretary needed, full-time. Must be organized, friendly, and professional. I wasn't particularly religious, but desperation didn't leave room for preferences. The pay was decent, the location was close, and at this point, I'd take anything. I grabbed my phone and applied. The job at Grace Community Church started off simple. Answering phones, scheduling meetings, organizing events, it was nothing I couldn't handle. Pastor Scott Thompson was a professional, well-spoken man. He had a way of making people feel comfortable, and I admired how much the church members respected him. His wife, Rebecca, was equally kind. She often stopped by my desk to chat, always with a warm smile. At first, I felt lucky to be working in such a peaceful place. But soon, I started noticing things, subtle things, that made me wonder if I was imagining them. The attention. At first, it was just friendly conversation. "How are you settling in, Hannah?" Pastor Scott would ask as he passed by my desk. I'd smile and nod. "Good, thanks." But soon, his questions became more personal. "So, do you have family nearby? Do you live alone? What do you like to do for fun?" I told myself it was just small talk. He was a pastor, after all. His job was to connect with people. But then, there were the compliments. "You have a very calming presence," he said one afternoon as I was typing up a sermon outline for him. "It's rare to find someone so poised at your age." Another time, when I had my hair pinned up, he walked by and said, "That hairstyle suits you, Hannah." The words were innocent. Harmless. But it was the way he said them. The lingering pauses. The way his eyes held mine for just a second too long. I wasn't sure what to think. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he was just kind. But then, there were the small touches. The lingering moments. The first time it happened, I barely noticed. I was handing him a folder, and his fingers brushed against mine. It was so brief that I wouldn't have thought twice about it if he hadn't looked at me afterward. His blue eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, something unreadable behind them. Then he smiled and thanked me, as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was nothing. Accidental. Meaningless. But it happened again. And again. A touch on the arm when he walked past. A hand on my shoulder when he leaned over my desk to check the calendar. Every interaction felt like it lasted just a beat too long. And then, Rebecca started watching me. Rebecca's eyes. Rebecca Thompson was one of the kindest women I had ever met. She was warm, welcoming, always making sure everyone felt included. But I started noticing something different in the way she looked at me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. But whenever I was talking to Pastor Scott, I'd catch her watching from across the room. Not in a jealous way. Not angry. Just watching. One afternoon, while I was organizing donation records, she came to my desk and leaned in slightly. "You must really enjoy working here," she said, her voice gentle. I nodded. "I do. It's a great job." She smiled, but there was something off about it. Like she wanted to say something else but held back. And for the first time, I wondered, did she notice the way her husband looked at me? A moment alone. One evening, I was the last one in the office. The rest of the staff had left, but I stayed behind to finish some paperwork. I was focused on my screen when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned. Pastor Scott stood in the doorway. Oh, I said, startled. I thought everyone had gone home. He smiled. I was just locking up and saw your light on. I nodded, suddenly feeling aware of how quiet the church was. You're very dedicated, Hannah, he said, stepping inside. Not many people your age would be willing to stay late like this. I gave a small shrug. Just trying to do a good job. He nodded, his eyes holding mine for a moment longer than necessary. Then he smiled. I appreciate that. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving me with a strange feeling in my chest. Was I imagining this? Was there something more behind his words, his touches, his stares? Or was I reading into things that weren't really there? Either way, I couldn't ignore the feeling growing inside me. Something was changing. And I didn't know what to do about it. I told myself I was imagining things. Pastor Scott was a good man, a respected leader, a devoted husband. His kindness was part of his job. The compliments, the lingering looks, the accidental touches, maybe they meant nothing. But the feeling wouldn't go away. And soon, it became harder to ignore. The conversations changed. At first, our conversations had been about work, scheduling meetings, organizing events, handling church records. But over time, they became more personal. One morning, as I was typing up a document in his office, he leaned back in his chair and studied me. You seem different from most young women your age, he said. I looked up. Different how? You're mature. Composed. There's something about you that's rare. His voice was smooth, careful. His words felt intentional. I forced a polite smile and turned back to my screen. I guess I've just had to be independent for a long time. He nodded, still watching me. I admire that about you. I swallowed, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. There it was again. That feeling. The gift. A few days later, he left a small box on my desk. I found it after lunch, a neatly wrapped package with a golden ribbon. My name was written on a card in elegant handwriting. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to think. It wasn't expensive or flashy, but it felt personal. Too personal. That afternoon, I found him in his office and held up the box. Pastor Scott, what is this? He smiled. Just a small gift. A token of appreciation for all your hard work. I hesitated. I don't think I can accept this. His expression softened and he stepped closer. Hannah, it's nothing inappropriate. Just a gesture of gratitude. I wanted to believe him. But when I glanced up, I caught Rebecca standing in the doorway. Rebecca's warning. Her face was unreadable, but her eyes flicked from me to the bracelet in my hand. I quickly lowered it to my side. Mrs. Thompson, She gave me a small, tight smile. Can I borrow my husband for a moment? Pastor Scott turned to her, his expression calm. Of course. I left the room quickly, my heart hammering. For the rest of the day, I avoided looking in her direction. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Had she suspected something? Did she already know? The moment that changed everything. A week later, it happened. It was late in the afternoon, and I was in the supply room, sorting through some donation records. I didn't hear him come in. Hannah. I turned, startled. Pastor Scott stood in the doorway, watching me. I let out a small breath. You scared me. He chuckled. Sorry about that. I expected him to leave, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. My pulse quickened. The room suddenly felt too small. He took a slow step closer. I just wanted to check in on you. You've been distant lately. I forced a nervous laugh. Just busy with work. He studied me for a long moment. Then, softly, he said, I think about you, Hannah. My breath caught. His eyes held mine, steady and unflinching. I swallowed. I should get back to. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. My whole body tensed. The warmth of his fingers lingered against my skin for a second too long. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open. Rebecca stood there. For a moment, no one moved. Then, she spoke, her voice cool and measured. Scott. Just his name. But it was enough. Pastor Scott stepped back, his face unreadable. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Rebecca's gaze flickered to me, then back to her husband. Dinner's ready. Then she turned and walked away. I stood there, frozen. She knew. And I had no idea what would happen next. For the rest of the evening, my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Rebecca had seen us. I replayed the moment over and over again, her cool, measured voice, the way her eyes flickered between me and her husband. She hadn't shouted, hadn't accused, hadn't even looked angry. But she had seen. And that was enough. A quiet tension. The next day at work, I expected something to happen. A confrontation. A conversation. Something. But everything seemed normal. Too normal. Pastor Scott barely looked at me during our morning meeting. His usual warm glances, the subtle smiles, gone. Rebecca passed by my desk like she always did, but her usual kindness felt rehearsed, almost too polite. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe she hadn't thought much of what she saw. Maybe it didn't mean anything. But by the afternoon, I realized I was wrong. Rebecca's conversation. I was sorting paperwork when Rebecca appeared at my desk. Do you have a minute? She asked, her voice smooth, unreadable. I nodded slowly. Of course. She gestured toward one of the empty side rooms. I hesitated before following her inside. She closed the door behind us. For a moment, she just looked at me. Not angry. Not accusatory. Just studying me. Then she smiled, soft, but sharp. You've been such a blessing to this church, Hannah, she said. I swallowed. Thank you. She tilted her head slightly. You know, I was about your age when I first met Scott. I didn't move. He was charming, she continued. Charismatic. The kind of man who makes you feel seen. I felt my stomach tighten. She smiled again, but there was something behind it, something knowing. You're a smart girl, Hannah, she said softly. I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. My throat felt dry. I did understand. She wasn't accusing me. She wasn't attacking me. She was warning me. Scott's confession. Later that evening, I stayed late to finish up some reports. The church was quiet, most of the staff already gone. I was shutting down my computer when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Hannah. I turned. Pastor Scott stood in the doorway. I swallowed, my pulse quickening. Pastor. He stepped inside, closing the door. Did Rebecca speak to you today? I nodded slowly. A small sigh escaped him. She's just protective. I didn't say anything. He took a slow step closer. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. I let out a small, nervous laugh. I think we crossed that line a while ago. He exhaled, his expression unreadable. I didn't mean for this to happen. For this to happen. I swallowed hard. Then what did you mean? He hesitated. Then, softly, he said, I think about you, Hannah. The room felt smaller. The air, heavier. I shook my head. You're married. I know. His voice was quiet. But I can't pretend I don't feel something. I took a slow step back. This isn't right. He didn't argue. He just watched me. I turned toward the door, my heart hammering. I think I should leave. Before I could move, his hand gently caught my wrist. Hannah. I yanked away like I had been burned. He froze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I whispered, "This can't happen." His expression darkened with something unreadable. I know. I turned and walked away, my pulse pounding in my ears. The next morning, I found an envelope sitting on my desk. My name was written neatly on the front. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter. A short one. Hannah. We appreciate everything you've done for this church. I think it would be best if we started looking for someone new to fill your role. Consider this your 2 weeks' notice. Best. Rebecca Thompson. I stared at the words, my vision blurring. I had been fired. Not by Scott. By his wife. And somehow, it felt like she had one. I sat there, staring at the letter, my hands gripping the edges so tightly the paper wrinkled beneath my fingers. Fired. Not officially, not with harsh words or accusations. Just a polite dismissal. A carefully written message that told me everything I already knew. Rebecca was ending this before it could go any further. I should have felt angry, humiliated, maybe even relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. The final days. I still had 2 weeks left at Grace Community Church. 2 weeks of pretending everything was fine, of avoiding Pastor Scott's eyes, of ignoring the way Rebecca walked past me like I was already gone. She didn't gloat. She didn't rub it in. Because she didn't have to. She had handled it perfectly. I had no choice but to pack my things, say my goodbyes, and disappear. A few days before my final shift, Pastor Scott called me into his office. I hesitated at the door, my fingers tightening around the strap of my bag. "You wanted to see me?" He nodded. "Close the door." I did, moving slowly as I stepped inside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. This wasn't how I wanted things to end. I swallowed hard. But it's for the best. His eyes met mine. Is it? I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You have a wife. A reputation. A church that looks up to you. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. Hannah, do you really think this was one-sided? My stomach twisted. I don't know what I think anymore. His gaze softened. If things were different. I cut him off. But they're not. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he nodded. I guess this is goodbye, then. I hesitated, a lump forming in my throat. Goodbye, Pastor Scott. And I walked away. The last glance. On my final day, as I stepped outside the church for the last time, I glanced back. Scott stood at his office window, watching me. Rebecca stood in the doorway, arms crossed. And I realized then that this was never going to end any other way. Rebecca had won. But maybe I had too. Because as I walked away, for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The end.